Johnny Carson was a mean-spirited human being.
I always get a little awkward introducing Jimmy Stewart. There are so many things you can say. He does not need a monumental introduction. He has been a major Hollywood star for...
Johnny Carson was known as the king of late night, and his legendary Tonight Show brought laughter into millions of homes. But behind the charm, not every guest who sat on his couch was as innocent as they seemed. Some Golden Age celebrities exhibited weird behaviors that left even Carson uneasy. These weren't just quirky personalities. Some were downright evil. Join us in this video as we pull back the curtain to reveal 9 Golden Age guests who, according to Carson and those who knew them best, weren't the stars fans thought they were. Let's get into the details. Number 9. Bette Davis. Bette Davis was Hollywood royalty. With her sharp voice, fiery wit, and 2 Academy Awards, she was already a living legend by the time she appeared on The Tonight Show. Audiences loved her for her old Hollywood stories, her larger-than-life personality, and that unforgettable presence she carried into every room. On camera, she was captivating, funny, commanding, and utterly unmissable. But behind the curtain, Carson and his crew discovered a very different Davis. Off-stage, she was confrontational, cutting, and impossible to please. She didn't just toss out witty remarks. She cut people down to size. If another guest, especially a younger star or another woman, began to shine, Davis would interrupt, dominate the moment, and even turn her back to them as though they weren't even there. One talent coordinator remembered watching her seethe when the spotlight wasn't on her, already plotting how to steal it back. Her behavior wasn't just limited to the guests. Staff members weren't safe either. Davis demanded whiskey in her dressing room before tapings, and when she drank, her tongue turned even sharper.
We love to smoke.
Oh, you shouldn't say that.
What are you going to do about it?
I'm trying to quit.
You know what I think? You're trying to quit.
Yes, ma'am.
Crew members recalled her hurling sexist or racist remarks without hesitation. A makeup artist remembered Davis refusing her work, sneering, "Find me someone whose hands don't shake like a drunk." For people who worked behind the scenes, it was brutal. Johnny Carson usually avoided direct confrontations, but Davis pushed him to his limit. During one rehearsal, she berated a cue card holder for being too slow. Carson stepped in, quiet but firm. "Miss Davis, on this show, we speak to everyone with respect, or we don't speak at all." The legendary actress was stunned. Not many people dared to challenge her, and she actually backed down. Still, the damage had been done. Carson admired Davis's extraordinary talent, but he believed talent didn't excuse cruelty. After her last appearance in the early 1980s, he turned to his producer and said, "That's the last time." Life's too short to be verbally flogged by Bette Davis, no matter how many Oscars she has. So, if Davis drained Carson's patience, what chaos did the next guest on the list unleash next? Keep watching to find out. Number 8. Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney was Hollywood royalty. For years, he was the #1 box office star, a living bridge to the golden age of film. By the time he sat across from Johnny Carson, his appearances should have been nostalgic celebrations of a legendary career. But instead of warm memories, Rooney's visits became infamous for all the wrong reasons. According to staff, what viewers saw on camera barely scratched the surface. Behind the scenes, Rooney's behavior was erratic, inappropriate, and at times deeply uncomfortable. Carson, who often kept his frustrations private, was once overheard telling his producer after a particularly disastrous show in the mid-1970s, he thinks being short gives him license to be a pervert. The comment wasn't without reason. Female staff members dreaded his visits. Rooney developed a reputation for ignoring boundaries, grabbing hands, pulling young assistants closer, and making suggestive comments that were wildly out of place. One former assistant remembered him holding her wrist just a little too long when she tried to step away. Others admitted they would ask to be reassigned whenever his name showed up on the guest list. Rooney's drinking only added to the chaos. Tonight Show employees recalled at least 3 separate occasions when he appeared visibly intoxicated. slurring words, and losing his train of thought mid-sentence. During one 1977 taping, he began a story about Judy Garland that quickly turned inappropriate, forcing Carson to step in, cut him off, and steer the conversation away. Off camera, during the commercial break, Johnny reportedly leaned over to his producer and asked, "Is he drunk? Or is this just who he is now?" Part of the difficulty came from a generational gap. Rooney, born in 1920, was raised in a Hollywood culture where certain behaviors toward women weren't just tolerated, they were normalized. But Carson had clear standards about professionalism, both for himself and his guests. A longtime director explained, Johnny wasn't a prude, but there were lines, and Mickey kept crossing them. Rooney, however, seemed almost puzzled when confronted, as if he couldn't understand why anyone would take issue with his behavior.
Oh, you because of the marriage, obviously.
No. I know, but you're doing a lot of marriage jokes.
But you make me look like an amateur, Knight.
The breaking point came during one episode where Rooney repeatedly made inappropriate remarks toward a young actress seated alongside him. After the taping, Carson did something highly unusual. He personally apologized to the actress, telling her, "That's not how professionals act on my show, and it won't happen again." A director later said, "I'd never seen Johnny so embarrassed by a guest's behavior." From that moment on, Carson made adjustments. Rooney's appearances grew less frequent, and when he was booked, producers often scheduled him for daytime pre-tapings rather than live evening broadcasts. It was Johnny's quiet way of drawing a line, still honoring Rooney's status as a Hollywood icon, but refusing to let chaos and misconduct ruin the integrity of his show. After Rooney shocked Carson with chaos, which guest chilled with cold control? Let's find out. Number 7. Joan Crawford. When Joan Crawford appeared on The Tonight Show in 1970, viewers saw exactly what they expected: a Hollywood legend in full command of her image. With flawless posture, immaculate style, and carefully measured charm, Crawford embodied the very definition of old Hollywood glamour. On camera, she was radiant and poised, every word sounding like it had been carved in stone. But according to those who worked behind the scenes, the Crawford who dazzled the audience was a far cry from the one they endured off camera. She was one of the coldest people I've ever interviewed, Carson later admitted to his biographer. Like talking to a beautiful statue with nothing inside. The problems began long before Crawford set foot on stage. Her team sent a 4-page memo detailing her demands: specific lighting angles, precise chair placement, the exact height of Johnny's desk, and even the studio temperature locked at 67 degrees, no higher, no lower. A former producer said, everything had to be precise. It was like preparing for royalty, except the Queen had no warmth. When she finally arrived, 3 hours early, Crawford brought her own makeup team, brushing aside the show's award-winning artists. But what truly unsettled the staff wasn't her vanity. It was her icy treatment of people she deemed unimportant. She practically curtsied to Johnny, a stagehand recalled. But when a young production assistant brought water to her dressing room, Crawford erupted. Witnesses described a tirade so vicious that the hallway fell silent. Crawford allegedly called the 20-year-old woman, a newcomer to the industry, a brainless little whore, and sneered that she should try her luck at a brothel, where incompetence might be more welcome. The assistant fled in tears, and Crawford demanded she be fired on the spot. Carson's producer refused, but the tension lingered like smoke through the rest of the evening. What disturbed the staff most, however, was Crawford's ability to transform the moment cameras rolled. A producer later recalled, she was like a machine, pretending to be a woman. Every laugh, every pause, every story, rehearsed to death. Nothing was real. During commercial breaks, Crawford would drop her mask completely, sitting in stone-faced silence until the red light blinked on again, when she would instantly reanimate with polished glamour. Even Carson, famous for his gift at making guests feel at ease, couldn't pierce the facade. After the taping, he reportedly turned to Ed McMahon and said, "I've interviewed corpses with more personality." Years later, when Christina Crawford's memoir, Mommy Dearest shook Hollywood with allegations of Joan's abusive behavior at home, Johnny wasn't shocked in the least. According to close friends, he simply nodded and said, "I saw who she really was in those few hours. I believe every word." This next guest turned humor into hostility. Who could he be? Stay tuned to find out. Number 6. Chevy Chase. Johnny Carson had a rare gift. He could put almost anyone at ease, balancing humor, charm, and authority in a way that made The Tonight Show the smoothest hour on television. But not every guest slipped easily into Carson's rhythm, and few disrupted it as much as Chevy Chase. By the mid-1970s, Chase was a breakout star from Saturday Night Live, his sarcastic smirk and deadpan humor making him one of the most recognizable comedians in America. Millions adored him, but Carson saw something different. Fame wasn't the problem. Carson dealt with big egos all the time. The real issue was how Chase carried that fame. Chase's humor leaned heavily on sarcasm, delivered with a cool detachment that often felt less like playful banter and more like sharp edges. Carson's show thrived on warmth and wit, with jokes that made both host and guest look good. But when Chase sat in the guest chair, the energy changed. His quips landed not as teasing but as cutting, sometimes even mean-spirited. For Carson, who built his reputation on making guests shine, the shift was jarring. Carson was no stranger to strong personalities. He could handle sharp wit. He enjoyed sparring with Don Rickles, Muhammad Ali, or anyone who brought intensity to the stage. But with Chase, it wasn't a dance. It was a one-man act. His confident swagger and subtle air of superiority signaled he wasn't just there to join the fun. He was there to take the spotlight. That rubbed Carson the wrong way, especially as whispers circulated through NBC that Chase was being floated as a possible heir to late-night television.
I met your wife. She's very nice. Is she an entertainer?
She's on the show. She's one of my major guests.
With SNL skyrocketing in popularity, some executives saw Chase as the kind of bold, young figure who could one day step into Carson's shoes. For Johnny, who had built The Tonight Show into a nightly institution, that was more than irritating. It was a threat. Carson never publicly criticized Chase, but insiders noticed the lack of chemistry. Their exchanges lacked the easy spark Johnny had with his favorite guests. Instead of playful laughter, there was an awkward chill, a sense of two men circling each other rather than connecting. And when the cameras stopped rolling, the tension only grew. In late-night television, timing and tone mattered as much as the jokes themselves. Carson needed guests who understood the rhythm, who knew when to give and when to take. With Chevy Chase, that rhythm broke. For the master of smooth television, some guests simply weren't worth the disruption. If Chase unsettled Carson, who arrived with shadows more dangerous? Let's find out. Number 5. Frank Sinatra. On screen, Frank Sinatra and Johnny Carson looked like old friends. The chairman of the board would trade jokes, tell stories, and sometimes even sing a tune, while Carson played the respectful host. To the millions watching at home, it was two giants of American entertainment sharing a stage. But behind the curtain, Carson felt something very different. He admired Sinatra's talent, everyone did, but he despised the way Old Blue Eyes treated people when the spotlight wasn't on him. Carson once confided to a friend, according to multiple biographies, if he didn't sing, he'd be a mob enforcer. And sometimes, I think he was both. Sinatra's visits to The Tonight Show created instant tension. He rarely arrived alone. Instead, he swept in with an entourage of up to 8 men. They weren't show business types. As one cameraman put it, they were guys you wouldn't want to meet in an alley. They spread through the studio like security, watching everyone, creating an atmosphere that felt less like a TV taping and more like surveillance. But what unsettled Carson most was how Sinatra treated those he considered beneath him. During one early 1970s appearance, a floor manager gave the standard 3-minute warning before airtime. Instead of acknowledging it, Sinatra reportedly grabbed the man by his tie, yanked him close, and growled, "Nobody tells me when I've got 3 minutes. I'll go on when I'm ready." The floor manager, a Korean War veteran in his 50s, was left shaken. Watching on a monitor from his office, Carson nearly canceled the segment on the spot. Only the reminder of the rating Sinatra guaranteed convinced him to go forward. Sinatra also proved infuriatingly unreliable. He was known to cancel appearances at the last minute, sometimes hours before taping. On one occasion, he was already in the building, but abruptly decided he wasn't in the mood. For Carson, who valued professionalism above everything, this was unforgivable. The breaking point came during a commercial break when Sinatra made a disparaging remark about a female staff member's appearance, loud enough for others to hear. Carson, usually the model of restraint, turned to him and said coldly, "We don't talk about my staff that way here." The studio froze. Sinatra, visibly surprised that anyone would dare challenge him, especially Johnny Carson, quickly went silent. When the cameras came back on, both men slipped into their practiced charm, but staff noticed a shift. Carson's questions were shorter, his engagement minimal, as if he was counting down the minutes until Sinatra was off stage. Afterward, Carson reportedly told his producer, "I don't care what his ratings are. Limit him to once a year maximum." For Carson, who rarely interfered with booking decisions, that decree spoke volumes. To him, Frank Sinatra wasn't just difficult, he was toxic. The next guest on the list let his unchecked ego run wild. Who could this person be? Keep watching to find out. Number 4. Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis was a household name. As a comedian, actor, director, and even humanitarian, his legend stretched across decades. Millions adored his manic slapstick routines, his quick-fire wit, and his famous telethons that raised millions for children's health. To the outside world, Lewis was more than an entertainer. He was a saintly figure, but Johnny Carson and his staff saw another side. When Lewis appeared on The Tonight Show, the mask of charity slipped. Behind the scenes, the man who claimed to care so deeply about people could be shockingly cruel to those who worked hardest to make him look good. According to multiple staff accounts, Lewis treated production crews with open contempt. He barked orders, refused to learn anyone's name, and reduced professionals to dismissive labels like "Hey, you," or "Camera guy." And Lewis didn't stop at the crew. He went after Carson himself. During one infamous appearance, Lewis repeatedly interrupted Johnny, hijacking questions intended for other guests. At one point, he even reached over and adjusted Carson's tie without permission. The move seemed small, but for Carson, it was deeply insulting. Everyone on staff knew the unspoken rule. You didn't touch Johnny Carson unless Johnny Carson initiated it. Lewis knew it too. Insiders believed he did it deliberately. A power move designed to establish dominance in front of millions. What enraged Carson most wasn't the arrogance, but the hypocrisy. He'd seen Lewis cry on national television during his charity telethons, weeping for children as the cameras rolled. Yet behind the scenes, he was cold, dismissive, and openly hostile to anyone who couldn't advance his career. One longtime staffer described him as demeaning, dismissive, and downright hateful. Carson, who rarely let personal feelings affect bookings, made his disgust clear after one appearance. He reportedly told a colleague, "He's what happens when ego outruns talent." Eventually, Carson had had enough. Following a particularly tense encounter in the early 1980s, he made the rare decision to blacklist Jerry Lewis from The Tonight Show entirely. For a man who tolerated difficult guests for the sake of ratings, this was almost unheard of. Years later, Carson still didn't soften his stance. In private conversations, he admitted that in a town overflowing with egos and phonies, Jerry Lewis stood out. To Johnny, he wasn't just arrogant, he was one of the most hateful people ever to sit in his guest chair. If Lewis flaunted ego, who drained the room of life? Let's find out. Number 3, Bob Hope. For decades, Bob Hope was NBC's crown jewel. The network adored him, audiences adored him, and his name carried a weight few could rival. When he walked onto The Tonight Show, he brought more than star power.
It's always kind of nice when Bob Hope comes to Los Angeles for one of his recent stopovers, because we usually get him on the show.
He brought a script. Hope's team made sure of it. Days before each appearance, thick envelopes would arrive at the studio, stuffed with pre-approved jokes, interview prompts, and even camera directions. By the time Hope sat in the guest chair, every beat had been mapped out. For Johnny Carson, who thrived on unscripted brilliance and the joy of chasing a laugh in the moment, it was suffocating. He was reduced to a cue card reader on his own show. The tension was obvious. Hope didn't make eye contact during their conversations. His gaze locked on the cards propped behind the cameras, waiting for Carson to feed him the next line so he could fire off another pre-packaged punchline. When Johnny tried to push the conversation in a spontaneous direction, Hope simply ignored it, shuffling back to the script. The audience still chuckled. They always did, but the spark wasn't there. Behind his desk, Carson's pencil twitched in his grip, the frustration barely concealed. It wasn't just the forced rhythm that grated on Carson. It was the constant promotion. Hope rarely offered fresh stories or genuine memories. Instead, his appearances turned into infomercials. During one 1978 taping, he name-dropped Texaco 3 times in under 10 minutes. Carson, desperate to keep the energy alive, quipped, "Texaco gets more airtime than I do." The crowd laughed, but Johnny's weariness bled through. Backstage afterward, a staffer recalled him muttering, "I'm the warm-up act for a corporate sponsorship." What made it worse was that Hope wasn't just a guest, he was a fixture. NBC executives insisted on bringing him back again and again, even when he had nothing new to say. He delivered ratings, drew older viewers, and his specials pulled in millions. When Carson suggested cutting down Hope's appearances in favor of fresher comedians, the network gently reminded him who was keeping the lights on. Johnny relented, but not without conditions. Producers began strategically buffering Hope's visits, slotting a musical act or a livelier guest afterward to pump life back into the room. Still, the chill lingered. One staffer put it simply, every time Hope walked into the building, the temperature in Johnny's dressing room dropped 10 degrees. Off camera, there was no feud. They were polite, professional, and even cordial. Carson smiled, Hope delivered his lines, and NBC kept cashing in. But those who looked closely could see it in Johnny's eyes. Behind the practiced grin was a man counting down the minutes until the segment ended. For Carson, whose magic came alive in spontaneity and authentic connection, Bob Hope's appearances were a slow grind. Despite his legendary status, Hope brought no rhythm, no melody, only obligation. And for the host who lived to improvise, that made all the difference. If Bob Hope left Johnny Carson cold, then what can we say about Fred Rogers? Let's find out. Number 2, Fred Rogers. Fred Rogers left Carson unsettled when he stepped into the show. On paper, it looked like a charming booking. Pair late night's sharpest host with the warmest man on television. Even the show memo promised a quick 5-minute segment. Maybe a puppet, maybe a gentle laugh. Safe, easy. But the moment Fred Rogers stepped under the studio lights, everything shifted. He didn't rush onto the stage, soaking up applause the way most celebrities did. He strolled, paused.
I work with children, doing puppets in very personal communication with small groups.
And softly told the audience, "Thank you very much, friends. I'm very glad to be here." The crowd clapped, waiting for a punchline, but none came. The crew scrambled to cue applause, but the pause lingered. Timing, that invisible pulse that made Carson's show tick like a clock, suddenly slipped. Johnny tried to reset the moment. He kicked his leg up and revealed a surprise pair of white sneakers. "Fred, I wore these in your honor," he joked. Rogers folded his hands, smiled gently, and replied, "That's very thoughtful, Johnny. Sneakers can help us feel ready to play." The audience chuckled politely. waiting for Carson to volley back. But Johnny froze. Fred wasn't joking. He meant it. No punchline, no setup, just sincerity. And in late-night television, that landed like a full stop. Carson pivoted. He asked for funny fan mail stories, maybe a goofy kid anecdote, but Rogers didn't do funny for funny's sake. Instead, he shared a quiet story about a child afraid of bathtub drains, and how imagination could turn fear into understanding. Each sentence dropped slowly, spaced like lullabies, perfect for toddlers, deadly for 11:45 p.m. Behind the cameras, panic brewed. Stopwatch hands twitched. Writers scratched jokes off cue cards. Directors widened camera shots just to fill dead air. Carson, one of the smoothest broadcasters alive, sat nodding politely while sweating under his collar. And the unspoken rule hung over the set: you don't make fun of Fred Rogers. His image was too pure, too respected. To treat him like a typical guest risked making Johnny look cruel. But Carson couldn't fully engage either. The rhythm was broken. Viewers at home felt the stillness as warmth. Stagehands behind the curtain felt it as dread. When the commercial finally rolled, Carson exhaled hard, visibly relieved. The crew dubbed it a pacing disaster. Nielsen reports confirmed it. Rogers's segment saw a noticeable dip. The laugh counters, yes, they actually used hand clickers to track laughs, showed less than half the chuckles of the previous night's animal skit. The verdict? Sweet, but slow. Next time Rogers appeared, it was during the December holiday stretch, when audiences were softer and more nostalgic. Writers trimmed Johnny's monologue by 2 jokes to allow breathing room. They nudged Rogers to bring props. His red trolley, a puppet, just so Carson had something to riff on. Still, behind the curtain, backup plans remained. A musical act was always kept warmed up in case pacing lagged. Carson was always gracious on camera. He'd shake Fred's hand, thank him sincerely, and walk off, smiling. But once, after a particularly gentle interview, he leaned to a stage manager and whispered, "Book him after a stand-up next time. Not before. Daddy needs caffeine after that." Years later, when asked privately which guest was the hardest to interview, not the most difficult, but the most challenging, Carson smiled and admitted, "Fred Rogers. Wonderful man, but the only time I kept checking the clock and my pulse at the same time." So, why was this next guest on the list among those whom Johnny Carson called evil? Stay tuned to find out. Number 1. Wayne Newton. In the 1960s and 1970s, Wayne Newton was everywhere on American television. He had a loyal fan base, especially in Las Vegas, where he headlined at the biggest casinos and built a reputation as one of the city's premier entertainers. Newton wasn't just a singer, he was a full showman. His good looks, polished style, and soft-spoken voice made him a standout act. He sang love songs with deep emotion, played multiple instruments, and knew how to hold an audience in the palm of his hand. For promoters, he was marketable. For fans, he was magnetic. And when he appeared on The Tonight Show, he was usually greeted with excitement. At first, Carson treated him with the same respect he gave to other rising stars. Newton was a polished professional, and Carson appreciated that. But over time, something changed. Carson's tone shifted, and soon Newton became the butt of Johnny's jokes. They weren't harmless one-liners either. Carson zeroed in on Newton's image. He mocked the singer's high-pitched voice and feminine appearance. The jokes weren't always direct, but the meaning was unmistakable. Newton was too pretty, too polished, too soft to be a real man in Carson's world. What Carson turned into a recurring gag, Newton experienced as a public humiliation. At first, he stayed quiet. Newton was still carving out his career, and he knew Carson was one of the most powerful men in television. Angering Johnny Carson was like stepping on a landmine. You might never recover. But the jokes didn't stop. Fans, friends, and even family started pointing them out. Newton could laugh them off in private, but the sting grew sharper each time Carson turned him into a punchline for millions of viewers. Finally, Newton had had enough. According to multiple accounts, including Newton's own retelling, he decided to confront Carson directly. No agents, no managers, no carefully worded letter. One afternoon in the early 1980s, Newton drove straight to NBC studios in Burbank, where The Tonight Show was filmed. He didn't make an appointment. He simply walked through the doors and asked to see Carson. When they came face to face, Newton didn't hold back.
I am here to straighten out whatever your problem is, and whichever way you want to straighten out, it's fine with me.
This wasn't a polite conversation or a quiet plea. It was a confrontation. Newton told Carson firmly and clearly that the jokes had crossed the line. They weren't funny, they were cruel, and he wasn't going to tolerate it anymore. He warned Carson, point blank, never to do it again. Carson, known for his icy wit and quick put-downs, was caught off guard. Newton wasn't laughing. He wasn't smiling. He was angry, and he meant every word. According to Newton, Carson tried to act calm, but his surprise was obvious. He reportedly said very little and backed down quickly. Newton left the studio with his message delivered and his pride intact. It was a rare moment in Tonight Show history. Very few people ever dared to challenge Johnny Carson so directly, especially in person. Even fewer walked away with a sense of victory. But Newton had done what almost no one else had. He had rattled the king of late night. After that day, Newton was quietly blacklisted from The Tonight Show. Carson had a long memory and an even longer grudge. Newton was never invited back, and his name disappeared from the booking sheets. But unlike with other feuds, Carson didn't get the last laugh. He didn't keep mocking Newton on air. The jokes stopped cold. And in Hollywood, people noticed. Years later, Newton reflected on the incident in interviews. He said he believed Carson was a mean-spirited man, and that the jokes were personal attacks, not harmless comedy.
Mr. Carson, these jokes about me will stop, and they'll stop now, or I will kick your ass.
He also said Carson was stunned by the confrontation because he wasn't used to people standing up to him. For Wayne Newton, it was a moment of pride. He defended his image, his dignity, and his career. For Johnny Carson, it was something else entirely, a quiet defeat. So, besides these 9 guests, who else do you think should have made it to the list? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the next video shown on your screen to catch up on your favorite celebrity stories. See you there.